welcome to another episode of Two Who's Review. I'm Alex,
And I'm Fitz.
and today we're looking at Girl in the Fireplace, the second Steve Moffat episode of the revived era, and the first under David Tennant. Now, as you may have noticed, we're going into this episode with two kind of different energies. Um, I am sort of I'm my normal self. I'm sort of like in presenter mode almost. Fitz, you sound kind of weary. Is there any reason for that, or
I love how falsely sort of like leading you are with that question. You know exactly what's gonna happen here.
no? I'm not actively trying to put on the tone of
No, no,
a parent in a dynamic who they know they're about to split up and they're trying to win favor with the kids before the divorce proceedings happen. That's not actively what I'm trying to do. I am conscious of that, but
Yeah, fair
but
enough.
why don't you because you haven't made any you haven't made it a secret in the past that you have a certain disdain for Steven Moffat. I think and we have reviewed a Moffat episode before, and I think that episode you didn't really bring up a lot of the stuff that you hated. I
Mm,
think largely because a lot of that stuff didn't show up.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so I can only imagine why you're a bit more. Uh, you sound a bit more fed up
Mm,
at the start
mm.
of this episode. Do you want to talk us through it? It's real quick
Yeah,
before we launch
yeah.
in.
Well, oh God, I'm gonna try like as hard as I can not to be like over melodramatic about this. I know I tend to be a little bit like that, but basically, folks, today's the day. Today's the day in which I'm able to really just articulate um, in a practical sort of sense what my issues with Moffat's writing are, in the sense that we've finally found an episode that has the most frustrating elements in Moffat's writing really rearing their head. I'm astonished I'm actually having to talk about this early, and in terms of the things I don't like about this episode, I cannot believe how frustrating, how painful they are when they show up. Like, oh my god. Like, okay, I'll start off by saying this, right? So Moffat, at a core level, is a good writer. Yeah, it's not like Chris Chibnall's writing, and this is not going to be like when we reviewed Destiny of the Daleks. Yeah,
Yeah.
there are basic elements in Moffat's storytelling that he's getting right. He's understanding how to use structure and irony and even humor and callbacks and foreshadowing, things like that. He understands how to do this on a basic level. In perhaps in some stories better than others. Indeed,
Yeah, definitely.
this is the guy who wrote Heaven Sent, but he also wrote Asylum of the Daleks, which, as far as I'm aware, is not a good episode.
That's
So,
sugarcoating it practically, but
mm, sorry.
calling Asylum of the Daleks not a good episode is a huge understatement.
But yeah, but you see what I mean. There is a mix there, but he understands how these things work.
Yeah,
Um, there may be some other smaller elements that may bother me, but that's like the technical elements is actually not what bothers me. It has taken me a long time to really figure this out. But I find like this hatred, this animosity towards a lot of what Moffat has written. I finally figured out what it is, and I'll just sort of summarize my argument really, really quickly. So, I can't stand it when I see unearned or gratuitous sentimentality in something. For me, it just feels, when it's not handled well in a story, it feels really there's something deceitful about it. Yeah, it just really gets my goat. So that's the first bit. Second bit is I think sentimentality, and again, that unearned sentimentality, it's at the core of a lot of Moffat's writing, and it manifests in a number of ways that really does annoy me. We obviously won't have time to go through them all at the moment, but the biggest way it manifests for me, is in the over mythologizing of the Doctor, and we are definitely going to get into that today, because basically, um, this is true, I think, generally of Moffat's writing of the Doctor, but especially in this episode. His sentimentality means that his characterization of the Doctor, to put it simply, is a bad one, as far as I'm concerned. It is such a I think it is a really gross mischaracterization of who this character is, of what they can say about the world of the show and the world in general. And it gets to the point, and again, I really don't want to go over the top about this, but honestly, it goes beyond just an element of poor writing for me. It goes beyond the what I assume are the common complaints about Moffat over mythologizing of the Doctor. For me, it gets to the point where it's morally repugnant for me, and we're
Right.
definitely going to get into that today. But basically, yeah, like he
Mm.
sort of mythologizes the Doctor to such a point that he becomes like a godhead. Um, and there are a bunch of issues related to that, which we'll get into. But that's basically I think the core issue. Like the sentimentality is the underlying thing. That's the thing that's impacting everything else. But the over mythologizing of the Doctor, underscored by the sentimentality, is the biggest issue. So
See,
yeah.
that's interesting because I have read reviews, positive reviews of the Moffat era that claim that people who say that he over mythologizes the Doctor are off base and coming at it from the wrong angle. Um, Now it is look. I'm not saying that either interpretation of Moffat's era is true.
Mhm.
Look, in all things, but especially in fiction, people will interpret things basically however they want to interpret
Mhm.
them.
Mhm.
Um, it's possible that there are things that both sides are missing, and
Mhm.
usually the truth kind of falls roughly in the middle.
Mhm.
Um, but I will say, just purely for this episode, I really don't see the mythologizing angle coming into it all that much.
Mhm.
The sentimentality, absolutely, it's there. I would argue it's for a different reason than maybe you would think it is. Um, but what I'm basically getting at is go in the fireplace. It's finally happening. We've hit upon an episode which we are going to have incredibly stark opinions of.
Mhm.
And I highly doubt this is going to be one of those situations where one of us is able to sway the other over the course of the time. Um, if it is, then egg on my face once again. Um, but I don't know. I just have a feeling that I don't know. Like it was. Look, I'll say this: it's definitely the weakest Stephen Moffat story of the Russell T Davies era. I'll put it that way. This
Yeah. Yeah.
isn't Empty
Yeah.
Child. It's certainly not Blink, and it's certainly not Silence in the Library.
No.
I think
No.
I don't think you'll. I think you'll be hard pressed to find many things you dislike about those episodes to this extent. I'll say that
Yeah,
much.
yeah, no, I'd agree with that too. Even like again, we haven't covered all those episodes yet, but even from memory, yeah, like even on a technical level, those are really good episodes, and even on the philosophical level, they're nowhere near as frustrating as this story is.
Yeah. But I don't want to get ahead of myself because I
Yeah,
think there are reasons for a lot of the stuff in this episode that
yeah.
you uh, maybe attribute more to Moffat than is otherwise earned.
Mhm. Mhm.
Uh, but anyway, yeah, go on the fireplace. Um, Look, I don't know how exactly to structure this, so I'm just going to jump straight to timescales because we
Yeah, yeah.
could go back and forth about this for a little while. I just want to sort of pretend like we have a structure before we start.
Before
Uh,
we do get into that, I will say this though.
Go on.
Given how critical I'm going to be about certain elements of this episode, the final score I will give it might actually surprise you and the audience.
Oh,
Um,
okay. So you're potentially gonna give it a more objective score, but with a little asterisk like, but
oh
personally
yeah,
there are
yeah,
things that I hate.
absolutely. Because
Okay,
as I said, this is not the same thing as Destiny of the Daleks. Destiny of the Daleks is just badly written across the board. This is a different thing.
sure. Well, look,
Yeah,
if you look, I don't think either of us are pretending to be like professional critics here. So
yeah, yeah.
you can feel free to give it a subjective score. I don't
Mm,
think anyone's gonna really fault you
mm,
for that. If it's your opinion, it's your opinion.
mm.
I don't. But like, yeah, you score it however you want.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I will
Because
say that.
like my
Yeah, go
main
ahead.
point with that is there are parts of this episode that I actually really like, and they're actually
Oh yeah, like definitely.
and they're indicative of elements in Moffat's writing that I actually really enjoy. It just
Mm.
kind of goes off the rails as it goes
Sure.
along. But
Well,
anyway,
I noticed that like one thing that you haven't faulted Moffat on is his boldness in terms of his sci-fi concepts.
yes,
Um,
I actually wrote that down in my notes. That's
yeah,
absolutely true.
and look, like it again. This isn't Blink. This isn't Silence in the Library. But for a 40-minute story that is largely a romance, there is a lot of like really unique sci-fi concepts
Yeah,
that
it's
come to play
wild.
here. Yeah, like, and look, I think, and one thing that I do think about Moffat in general is that at least on the face of it with his writing, it seems like, I'm not saying this is the case because I'm not in the
Mm.
man's head, but it seems like with a lot of his stories, he takes the approach of this is what I want to do. Now, how do I do it?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
the way I phrase that is like, um, uh, like he wants to have a weird zombie plague in the Blitz. Now, how do
Mm.
I make that happen? Oh, okay, I'll
Yeah.
make these nanogenes that do this and do
Mm.
this and that. I want to have the Doctor popping up in like random points in Madame de Pompadour's life in the 18th century. How can I do that? Well, there's a spaceship in the 51st century that's punching holes into
Mm.
different points in a timeline.
Mm.
I want to have a Doctor Light story that still has a lot of tension. How do I do that? Oh, I'll make the Doctor out of action because of this, and that.
Yeah.
There are a lot of Moffat stories in his own era where it doesn't seem like he's put enough legwork in to get to where he wants to get.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think a perfect example of that is Matt Smith's Regeneration story, where he's gone, I want to have Matt Smith regenerate this way, but to
Mm-hmm.
get there, I'm going to take a lot of steps that I don't think really work for the story as a
Mm-hmm.
whole.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or he'll do uh, I want to do a story about how important the Doctor and Clara mean to each other. The way I'm going to do that is I'm going to bring Gallifrey back in a really lackluster way and have the Doctor be really out of character. Um,
Uh-huh.
Hellbent is bad. We'll get there.
Mm-hmm.
But I think for the most part in the RTD era, a lot of that stuff is sort of circumvented, and maybe it's because Russell T Davies is that overarching figure who can go, okay, Moffat, maybe you have to put a bit more thought into this, maybe redraft it.
Mm.
But when Moffat's the head writer, he doesn't afford himself that luxury. He just
Yeah.
he hands in a script and goes, "I'm the head writer." If anyone has any
Yeah.
notes, and they'll go, "Oh no, it's good." I'm not saying
Yeah.
that there were a
Exactly.
bunch of yes men around when Moffat
He
was involved.
that and that. Yeah. And I think in a way that's kind of part of the one of the issues I have with sort of Moffat's writing. It's like when he writes really good scripts in the RTD era, and as we've said, this is essentially his least good. The others are
Mm,
amazing. They're great, but
yes.
once he becomes showrunner, he just runs for the fences. He's just doing whatever the fuck he wants. And that's part of the problem. We'll get to that later on once we actually get to the Moffat era.
Yeah,
But
and like sometimes there is enough thought put in, but other times there isn't.
yeah,
Um,
for sure, for sure. He's a very concept heavy writer, I think,
oh yeah,
and
yeah.
and it does work. Like there's a certain boldness even in this episode, and even the way it kind of we find out why these robots are going after the Duchess, and it's explained by it's the ship, and here's the weird thing, right? That is a little bit tenuous. It's
Mm-hmm.
not, I think, an amazing way to wrap the whole thing up, but it somehow doesn't bother me that much. Although that might be just because that's the least of my concerns with this story. So, yeah, that's the whole
Mm.
thing.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
Yeah, the one final thing. I'm sorry for these tangents, but the one
No,
final
it's okay.
thing I will say is this: purely because of this, sentimentality over mythologizing of a doctor, like the bad parts of this story, because of them, and we'll see how I feel once we get to the end of it. But
Mm-hmm.
at this point, I could not give this episode anything higher than a 6, purely because of those reasons. That's
Okay.
how much they impact it for me.
All right.
Yeah.
Um,
Anyway.
so with that in mind, the
Hmm.
average rating on the timescales for this episode out of 229 votes is a 9.
Oh no, God no, God no, God no.
um, yeah, look, it had it look the highest rating it's been given is a 10, but there are a lot of ranks below 9 that sort of bring the average down that low. Um, it's a well loved episode. A lot of people have called it the best episode in this season of TV. I
Um.
don't even I don't quite agree with that, and I don't have these kind of strong feelings about the episode that you do.
No.
I think that it's tough, but I do think Tooth and Claw is better than this, but only marginally. Like I'm not.
Mhm. Mhm.
They're very different beasts. No pun intended.
Mm.
But
Well,
this is where like ranking Doctor Who in terms of like best to worst becomes really difficult because
well,
you can have like
yeah.
two episodes after each other like a horror bent werewolf story, and then a sci-fi romance.
Yeah. Well,
So,
that's
and
the
like it's
nature of
really
the show.
difficult to it's really difficult to compare the two as well,
Mm.
which is why I don't think we're ever going to get to a point where we're like, and now let's rank every episode we've reviewed from best to worst, even the ones that have equal scores. Like, no, I don't think we can
yeah.
ever do that properly.
No, and that's just the nature of the show, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the weird thing is, right, even beyond my personal qualms with it, like, if you're breaking it down on a technical level, those elements work quite well, but, like, a 9, we're looking at, gas mask zombies level, right? This, even on a technical level, this isn't quite getting to that point, so I'm even
I think.
beyond my personal issues, I'm not quite saying that, but anyway.
Well, that's interesting. I think that's where we ranked gas mask zombies. Remember, but
Hmm.
I think they gave Timescales has that at a 9.2, so
And that's...
it's marginally better. So
Hmm. In any
um
case, yeah, it's curious.
yeah, it is curious. It is the highest rated series 2 episode on the timescales. And it's also the it looks like it's the 7th highest rated David Tennant story.
God, I remember the Cybermen episodes being better than this. Again, even beyond my personal issues with it. But anyway,
Yeah, I think a lot of people have
we'll get
problems
to
with the
that.
Cybermen episodes, which are like the next revived era story we're looking at, and I think those episodes are fantastic.
Yeah, I used to love them when I saw them as a kid. So,
But yeah, this episode has the exact same score as Waters of Mars and Silence in the Library.
No.
No, it's
Even
no.
like, even
Like,
like,
even if you think this is a 9, that means Waters of Mars has to be a 10 because
yeah,
I don't see how these are related in any way.
and even then, like again, regardless of my issues with Moffat, the Silence in the Library episodes, they're better than this as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, no, 100%. There's a lot more going on, and that's probably largely because they've got 2 episodes, whereas this is a 1 episode beast.
Yeah.
So this also has a 9 for plot as well.
Um, again, again, even beyond my personal issues, I wouldn't go that high simply because it's not like the plot, like it works and it's working pretty well, and how it all sort of feeds back into itself, and how it uses callbacks and um I'm blanking on that word now, where you're foreshadowing, excuse me. Yeah, it's doing that pretty well. But just like, again, a 9, we have to really be thinking like 9 level plots. It's just not quite getting there, I think.
Well, I think another thing to consider is like when you look at the previous stories that have come in this season, it's like like a I'm using standard in quotation marks here. It's like a standard infection story, a standard werewolf story, and then a standard basically a standard alien invasion Doctor Who story. I don't know if you can call this like a standard story because, like I said, there are a lot of interesting sci-fi concepts happening here. It is kind of a unique story for the show. I can't recall any episodes that are like any other episodes that are like this. So maybe that's why its plot is ranked a bit high. I mean, I don't think it's like far off because, like I said, I think the plot it moves along pretty briskly. There's enough to keep you guessing throughout.
Yeah.
It does a good job of drip feeding the information when it needs to. Like, there's a few decently executed story dumps at certain points that I think are handled really well. And then it all comes back in, as many Moffat stories do, in a neat little bow at the end. So I don't think it's that far off, but 9, I don't know, like, it's maybe a bit high. I don't know.
Sure.
9.3 for acting. Yeah.
Yeah. This one I'll give it. Even the side characters are really good.
Yeah.
Again, maybe as with a lot of Doctor Who, it is like a little bit over the top, but that's just the nature of the show,
Sure.
and it's fine. It works well.
There are 1 or 2 extras that are either too much or not enough.
Yeah.
That's
But beyond that, like, it doesn't. There's nothing really problematic there, and all our main cast are doing a good job. So
yeah,
that's fine. That's fair.
8.7 for effects.
Yeah. I mean,
Well,
maybe
a lot of it's done really practically, which I'm impressed by. Like, I think the only CG effect I can remember is the Doctor jumping through the glass, which does look shit.
And the spaceship itself when we see the exterior.
The spaceship itself, it's not that bad, but like the
No,
glass
no,
is very bad when it shatters and he rides through it on Arthur.
no. But
Um,
generally
but
speaking, like they're doing more practical effects, which is good because the
yeah,
practical effects are really cool. The Clockwork robots are fucking great.
oh, they look fantastic. They look
Yeah,
awesome.
yeah,
Um,
fantastic stuff.
and an 8.8 for replay. Now we're gonna have different
Mm,
thoughts on this one
mm,
because I think
mm,
when I rewatched this episode for the podcast, I was surprised at how my opinion of it kind of improved a bit,
mm-hmm.
and that might be shocking to hear, but legitimately, like I've always had the mentality of this episode as being like it's overrated. It's not and I still
mm-hmm.
think that to a
Mm-hmm.
certain extent. I still don't think it's the best episode of this season, but I think it
Mm-hmm.
is better than I remember it being. Purely because I think I've picked up on a couple of different kinds of motifs with this when concerning the larger narrative of Doctor Who itself.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I don't think like, unless you do have these opinions of Moffat's writing that you can notice, I don't
Mm-hmm.
think it would get worse on a rewatch because I don't
Mm-hmm.
think like I said, it would only get worse if you gone back to the Moffat era and you've spotted things that you hate about his writing, and then you would have rewatched this with those in mind, which I believe is what you've done.
um. Well, yes and no.
Mm-hmm.
So how shall I start this? Um. The Look, having gone through sort of my rocky relationship with Moffat's writing, it probably is coloring how I'm interpreting this. Here's the thing, though, I don't think it's doing it that much, and certainly not to the extent that I think you are, because um, there are certain elements of this story which, I mean, particularly like with the Doctor companion romance, we've talked about that before, and we'll talk about it more throughout this episode, but they've always frustrated me for reasons even since I was a kid.
Mm.
That element of this episode frustrated the shit out of me even when I was a kid, and it's only
Okay.
now that I've been able to sort of gather together the psychological tools and the vocabulary to really explain it. But even as a kid, like every time I thought of this sort of annoying element, this is the episode that came to mind. And
Right.
when it
Okay.
does get annoying again, even as a kid, it was fucking frustrating. So there's that. The second thing is in terms of just like pure replay value for how I view it now. This actively got worse for me on the second watch, and it got maybe slightly worse again on the third watch because I've watched it 3 times in the last 2 weeks, just as it happens.
Yeah.
It got to the point when the things that were annoying me in the first viewing of it, I was sort of rationalizing it to myself and saying, well, I mean, come on, Fitz, you may be exaggerating a little. I mean, yeah, they were annoying, but surely it wasn't that bad. I watched it again. Yeah, it was that bad. It was absolutely as bad as my gut reaction had interpreted it as. So, yeah, and because of that reason, the second time was worse because I had to realize how bad that initial shock was. So, yeah, for me, this actively got worse on a second and third watch. So, yeah.
Sure.
Hmm.
Um, Out of 111 people, 7 people say this requires a previous story. I think this is surprisingly standalone. I don't think there's like much like. Obviously, you need to have a knowledge of the show, but I don't think there is like a specific element of. I think the only thing would be the Rose dynamic and how Mickey plays off of her when regarding the Doctor's attitude towards
Mm-hmm.
Madame de
Mm-hmm.
Pompadour. That's the only thing where you sort of need to know
Mm-hmm.
the Rose Mickey Doctor dynamic
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
fully understand. But apart from that, it's fairly standalone.
Um, that So I agree and disagree. So it's only in terms of plot. Yes, you're right. There's not even to an extent with character. There's not much that links it to many other uh directly to any other stories. There's bits of foreshadowing of things that will show up later in the Moffat era, and they were
Yes.
annoying to see them here too, knowing where they're heading. But for the most part, yes, it was fairly standalone. However, and this is going to be again part of the crux of my argument. We'll get into it later. Um, the characterization of the Doctor in this story, for me, is so bad. It is so needlessly sentimental. It is so
Huh.
morally repugnant to me. I
Interesting.
shudder to think if this was your first sort of Doctor Who story, because the breadth of the Doctor's character, who they are, what they can say about the nature of the universe of Doctor Who and the universe generally, you get none of that here. There is such a lack of nuance in approaching his character. It is, for me, it's absolutely shocking.
Okay,
What
see,
that
this
looks
is the
like.
first time in this discussion where I've legitimately gone, did we watch the same episode?
Yeah, yeah, sure.
But let's put a pin in that for now.
Yeah, yeah.
So let's jump in properly now.
Mhm.
I think this is an incredibly small thing, but I think this episode has a very it takes a really unique approach to the cold open trope of start your
Mm.
story in the middle of the action and then jump back to the beginning of the story.
Yeah,
It does
immediate
that,
res.
but it in media res, yeah, it
Mm.
does that. But instead of doing like 3 weeks earlier, it goes like 3,000 years
Yeah, yeah.
later, which I think is just like it's a fascinating hook to go. Wait, later? I wasn't expecting to see the word later. What's going
Yeah,
on?
it's and look, this is actually the first third of the episode, the first act. This is for me where it's actually at its most enjoyable. Um, and this is partly why, again, as we've said, Moffat has got a boldness to him.
Yeah,
Arguably, that's, as I've said, one of the reasons kind of why I find some of his writing frustrating. But when when he does it well, and he's coming up with these strange, interesting concepts, man, they're great.
yeah. So
And
it's
yeah, it's
a
a great opening. It's so weird and freaky, and it's just, love it. I love it. It's great.
yeah. And
Hmm.
we slowly learn over the course of the story what's going on. And the full narrative is that there's a spaceship called the SS Madame de Pompadour,
Hmm.
and there's a crew and they've got these maintenance droids that operate on a clockwork system.
Hmm.
The ship sustains heavy damage and the clockwork androids go a bit on the fritz.
Hmm.
Something happens, and we'll learn later when these villains reappear that this is a common quirk of their design. Like they often break this way, where they'll
Hmm.
start to use odd or bad methods to try and repair things.
Mm.
Because what they initially do is when they run out of parts to repair the ship, they start using the crew.
Yeah, yeah,
It's a small aspect of the story, but God, is it chilling.
yeah. We did not have the parts.
Yeah,
It's
but also like just when you put together the someone's cooking reference from early in
mm.
the episode, um, and it's this really rather dark theme that sets the whole story up because that's why the
Hmm.
clockwork androids start going after the Madame de
Hmm.
Pompadour herself. They end up exhausting the entire crew. They put eyes in cameras. They put hearts in
Cortexes or
cortexes. Exactly, yeah. Um, and then, but then the ship's computer is still malfunction, is still damaged, and because the ship is called the Madame de Pompadour, they decide we have to get Madame de Pompadour's brain at the exact right age of the ship.
hmm.
Um, it's a tiny contrivance to get the story where it needs to go, but I don't have a big problem with it, largely because I think it elicits the reaction of like when it is revealed at the end of the episode, in a nice show don't tell way, where it sort of zooms out on the ship and you see the name
Yeah,
of the
yeah,
ship itself. You see that and you go, ah, and what you don't do is go, oh,
yeah,
oh.
yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a nice enough reveal that contextualizes enough of the episode that makes it work in
Yeah,
retrospect.
and I also noticed a small detail. Like, because you'd almost think, oh, there's a portrait of her in here. Like,
Hmm.
shouldn't that make it clear? But then I realized, oh no, that's exactly where the TARDIS landed, so they would never have seen it. So that's actually pretty good.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
and as I said, it's one of those things where it seems a little bit tenuous, and on a just on a technical level for me, that would stop it from getting to like a 9 certainly in terms of plot. But it's not that bad, and it certainly doesn't bother me. And again, not just because there are other elements in this story that bother me much more. It's just kind of okay. Yeah, I can accept that. Odd, but
Yeah,
sure,
yeah.
I can roll with it.
And then in order to get Madame de Pompadour, because they're obviously in the 51st century and she's well dead, even if they could dig her up, her brain would be non-existent
Yeah, yeah.
by this point.
So they have to go
Um,
back and.
yes, they use what energy is left in the ship to punch holes in time at
Hmm.
various parts of the ship and scan her life to try and find her at the correct age, and
Hmm.
then And then, in a very French Revolutionary way, cut off her head and
Hmm.
use the brain to power the ship's computer, and
Mm-hmm.
then continue the journey of the ship, where it would presumably reconnect with its port or whatever it is, and then there would be some very big questions raised when the ship gets back to
Mm.
its home planet with no crew and all these human parts. That I wonder what would have happened in that scenario, but it
Yeah,
doesn't
yeah.
matter. And then we're put into the story about halfway through all this, where the Doctor and
Mm.
Rose and Mickey arrive and just sort of have to piece everything together.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and the first thing we find is this fireplace.
Mm.
It's another it's another interesting situation because it's a very evocative image of this fireplace on a
Mm.
spaceship just by itself. And they comment on it. But it's another thing that Moffat loves to do. He likes creating these anachronistic images for his stories.
Mm.
Um, the little girl with this futuristic library in her television.
Mm.
Is a bunch of other stuff that comes up in over the course of his run.
Mm. Yeah.
And this one is it's another nice little hook because obviously we've had in the cold open Renette talking into the fireplace, so we already know that there is something going on, but we're not expecting it on a spaceship. So
Yeah, sure.
it's this nice drip feed of intrigue and the mysteries getting solved that I think is one of the strongest aspects of the episode. Like when it's purely like the science fiction side of the story, that's when this episode shines.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think I can see what you mean. So, yeah, like it is interesting way to open it.
Mm.
Just the nice contrast, 17th century, 3,000 years in the future. Even just visually, it's got a strange and interesting incongruous dynamic, which is it's good that Moffat's tapping into that. And I must say, and I've sort of touched on this before, but this is the kind of thing that like it almost could only happen in Doctor Who, yeah. Like maybe not
Oh yeah,
literally by 2006. Like there are plenty of other wacky sci-fi things, but like Doctor Who was I think certainly in television a pioneer of these sort of strange concepts.
yeah, yeah.
As I said, if you go back to The Chase, for example, roughly around the same time, the only other show that was, I think, doing other strange, fantastic sci-fi things like that would have been The Twilight Zone. So
Yeah.
certainly there's a lineage here, and it's good to see Moffat, tapping into that and understanding. Well, I can. This show is very strange. I can actually afford to really, push the boundaries and put something interesting. So yeah, that's really great.
Yeah,
Hmm.
and then we have the historical side of the episode, which is it's this microcosm of the life of a historical figure who I would venture a guess and say that not many people have heard of.
Mm.
Um, it's certainly no Queen Victoria or Charles Dickens.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a bold choice of historical figure because it would have been very easy to pick another well-to-do
Yeah, yeah.
uh, person who fits the bill. I don't know. I don't know if Marie Antoinette would have made much sense because I think she is somewhat loathed.
Hmm.
So I don't know who else you'd pick, but I think it's a good choice for this story. Again, purely because of the contrast of the dingy and sort of steamy uh, abandoned spacecraft
Mm.
to then this rather prim and posh Versailles mansion with the
Yeah.
King of France and his mistress.
Well, that's the thing. Another part of it that's kind of interesting in terms of what Moffat is trying to do, trying
Mm.
to foster this this connection between the Doctor and the Duchess. It makes sense sort of to pick her because when we think French aristocracy, we think generally speaking we think stuffy, we think ignorant, sort of not interested in venturing out of their incredibly narrow view and understanding of life. But the Duchess is different. She's got that quality that the Doctor sort of taps into, where she's interested in the universe and is scared by what she sees, but she's still got that kind of curiosity. So I think it,
Mm.
even I mean, I don't know how accurate that would be to history, but for the purposes of what Moffat's trying to do, it makes sense to pick somebody a bit differently, because it would be hard to imagine someone like Marie Antoinette or Napoleon Bonaparte or Louis
Mm-hmm.
the XIV uh, taking these attitudes.
So now I'm just imagining this episode, beat for beat, word for word, exactly the same, but it's Napoleon Bonaparte instead of Madame de Pompadour.
That
Is
would
that an
be
improvement?
that would be impossible.
I know, but I can imagine it, and it's funny to me.
Um. Anyway, yeah, fair enough.
Um,
Yeah.
well, I think this brings us onto uh, the characterization of Madame de Pompadour herself.
Mhm.
Um, I think there's that one scene which kind of stands out from the rest of the story when she's sort of walking in the garden with one of her
Mm.
friends, um, and they're talking about she hasn't met the King of France yet,
Mhm.
and she's talking about her aspirations, and it really cements the fact that this is a different time. Like
Yeah.
the every woman in France wants to meet the king and become
Mm.
involved, and it
Mm.
was. I think it was like obviously I'm not well versed in history, but by my understanding, it was largely the only way women back then could really like make
Mm.
something of themselves because there
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
weren't the opportunities back then.
Yeah.
Um, but then she's got there's this, but there's also like a self awareness
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. To
And I
be
think
sure.
that's largely why the character works in this context. And I think it's also why, well, especially when you consider that they pair her up with the Doctor in a semi-romantic way, it
Mm.
makes sense that they would pick a character who did get have a relationship in history in real life,
Mm.
but was doing it for maybe not the most romantic reasons in the world. It makes it a
Mm.
bit easier to stomach when she does have this quasi affair with the Doctor.
Mm. Mhm.
Um, that being said, I think we've been dancing around it a little bit throughout the episode so far. There is the romantic aspect of things,
Mm.
um, and it's something that neither of us particularly like that much. I have
No.
made it no secret
Mm.
that whenever it's been done with Rose in the past,
Mm.
uh, I've hated it.
Yeah.
And I this might sound hypocritical, but I strangely didn't have that much of an issue with it here. I don't think it's great, but I don't think it's as bad as when they do it with Rose. And I
I, d-
think
I,
there are
I
a
definitely
couple of
had
reasons for that.
issues with it. If I can go into this a little bit. So
Sure.
yeah.
You go first, and then I
Sure.
might
Sure.
counter with
Yeah.
some of the things that I noticed or
So
thought.
yeah. So there are two sort of elements to this, I think. So the first thing is, the fact that once again, the Doctor's having a romance with a person who's clearly, not 900 years old. And, like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, like, the fact that he meets her when she's a kid, like, the whole thing, it just. There is an ickiness there, right? And it's part of the issue of that I've mentioned before, where elements of Doctor Who, even Revival Who, just don't age very well. And I don't think
Yeah.
this particular element has. And I mean, how old would this episode be? Like 16, 17 years?
17 years old.
17. In any case, yeah, it's icky. Like, there's no way of getting around that. You can't. When you look at the fact that she kisses the Doctor, and by the way, when I was watching this episode the first time, I was distracted because I was writing notes about the episode when I was
Mm-hmm.
watching it, and it got to the bit where the guy says, "Who the bloody hell are you?" And the Doctor's like, "I'm the Doctor, and I just snogged Madame de Pompadour." And I think I physically flinched because, like, wait, what? He kissed her this early. I thought he didn't do that until the end. But then I looked back and then rewound in the timestamps and found, okay, I guess that's happening. That's a little yeah.
Yeah.
So that's part of it. And then later on, the flirty dialogue between her and And the doctor, when he asks how old she is, and she's like, such an impertinent question so early in the conversation, how promising. It's just the whole thing. It's just, yeah, there's just an ickiness to it, and
Yeah,
it's worth mentioning. Yeah, I think it's
sure.
important, like, to point out. It's the same thing with all the other things I've mentioned about Doctor Who's ethical sort of
Yeah, yeah,
missteps and how well it's aged and things like that.
sure.
It doesn't it doesn't for me personally ruin the whole episode. There are other
Mm-hmm.
elements that really frustrate me,
Well, yeah.
but but it doesn't, like, it doesn't ruin the episode for me. But it's certainly something worth mentioning. And certainly, if someone would watch this and think, "Oh, this is actually kind of really uncomfortable. I'm not sure how I really can deal with this." That's completely understandable. Anyway,
Cool.
so
If
that
I might
oh, so
jump
yeah,
in
no,
super
go ahead.
quick,
Yeah, go ahead.
because I think there is something, there's an important distinction to clarify,
Sure.
and I think that distinction is why I don't think it's as bad here as it has been with Rose.
Mhm.
So with the Rose and Doctor dynamic, they've
Mhm.
made it perfectly clear that it is not unrequited. You know,
Mm. Mm.
like
Mhm.
it's he all but says "I love you" to her multiple times over the
Mhm.
course of the show.
Mhm.
With this dynamic, my interpretation
Mhm.
is not that.
Mhm. You
Um,
say you would say it's one-sided in that sense.
I don't know if it's like entirely one-sided. My interpretation is that the
Mm.
Doctor's opinion of Madame de Pompadour
Mm.
is fascination more than
Yeah.
anything else,
Yeah.
and there's a couple of reasons for that.
Yeah.
Firstly, we never at any point like there's the moment that is the most obvious as a standout is the kiss.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the scene where I have to do the most wriggle room, I think, in order
Yeah.
to make my theory make sense. But
Sure.
first of all, she kisses him, like she's the
Mhm.
one that initiates it. First of all,
Mhm.
and then he's stunned after it, and I think that's the moment where the episode is kind of at its weakest. It's in terms of characterization of the Doctor, at least. But I think he is more fascinated by her than he is enamored by her. I
Yeah.
don't think there is a moment where he expresses like th- any kind of intimate feelings around her. He's
Mhm.
just more like, and then especially when he learns who she is,
Yeah, because he
he's like,
goes
"Oh
on
my
that weird
god, yeah,
little, yeah,
yeah," and I
that
think it's more
rave.
like, "Oh my god, this is the person that uh,
Yeah.
I get to meet," and
Mm.
like, and
Mhm.
she's being a bit forward, but she's French, so whatever. Um, but then later on, there's a lot. The Doctor never really has any moments of like uh, flirtation with her. It's usually her
Mhm.
doing it to him. Like in that scene where you
Yeah.
mentioned, like he asks her age and she
And
flirts,
she, yeah,
and then he breezes right past it
yeah.
and continues to do his own
Um,
Doctor thing.
that.
And then
Yeah.
when
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
she asks him to dance, and he goes, "No, I can't," several times.
Mhm.
He's
Mhm.
never shown to be like, "Oh, I would," but like it's a
Yeah.
different situation.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then
Sure.
at the
Sure.
end, when he sort of when he learns that she's died, and he's sort of sad about it.
Mhm.
Um, see, there's a couple of different ways that can be interpreted.
Mhm.
One is he's sad that she's obviously he's sad that she's dead, full stop. But
Mhm.
one interpretation is that, oh no, this person that I was interested in is gone,
Mhm.
and that makes me sad because I never got to do this that with
Yeah.
her in
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
romantic sense. But for me, and especially punctuated with the lonely god
Yeah.
line or
Yeah.
lonely angel or whatever it was,
Mhm.
it's just another way of punctuating that side of the Doctor and his loneliness because. And
Yeah.
it's something I
Mhm.
hadn't fully considered until I saw one of the timescales
Mhm.
reviews, but the entire dynamic between the Doctor and Madame de Pompadour in the story, it is a small-scale exploration of the Doctor-companion relationship, all summed up in one episode.
Right.
It's they
Um.
meet, they have these adventures, and then they leave his life, and he's alone again.
Yeah.
And when you look at it in that context, it's not as bad. Like there is a
Mm.
slight romantic bent to it, but I would argue that's more of a Russell T Davies thing than a Moffat thing, because again, the current companion in the show is one whose arc around the Doctor is romantic.
Mm-hmm.
That is the current companion relationship.
Mm-hmm.
The next companion, Martha, is going to be a significantly more one-sided version of that. And then when Moffat takes over, whenever his companions are romantically involved in the Doctor, he portrays it as a bad thing.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting thing. I must say, like assuming for a second that this was a more Moffat thing than RTD thing. I'm not saying it is, but assuming it was.
Yeah.
Even if it was though, like if you look at the 11th Hour, for example, and as I've said, it's been ages since I've seen it. You've got a better understanding of it than I do.
I do, yeah.
But would you say that in terms of sort of framing this sort of issue ethically, the icky part of it, the infidelity part of it, whatever, would you say that Moffat kind of learns from his mistake in the
He
11th Hour?
definitely. Well, it's not in the 11th hour that the romantic stuff comes up. It's a couple of episodes afterwards, but it is sort of born from their first encounter in the 11th hour. And look, people seem to have a lot more of a problem with it when Amy comes onto the Doctor than when Rose does it, but I think that's because the episode goes so out of its way to present it as a bad thing that it's more noticeable. With a lot of the Rose stuff, I feel like it's much worse, but because the show presents it as not a bad thing, people just haven't noticed it, or maybe it's because that's what people are used to just from TV in general. Like when they
because then they're
start
not
Doctor Who, they're used to there being a big, will they, won't they kind of thing with the main characters.
There's at the very least this issue they're being uncritical of it, the way they're framing it in the narrative. That makes sense. So I got a couple of thoughts on that. I think, look. And the element of that romantic undercurrent between the Duchess and the Doctor, that could very well be just a symptom of mid-2000s TV. I'd be willing to accept that. I just think they shouldn't have put it in there in the first place. It's not because it doesn't for me add anything to the characterizations, because it is so icky. They just shouldn't have even brought it up. They shouldn't have had it put in there at all. And that, I think it's mainly just a symptom of Moffat and to an extent RTD just sort of saying, okay, well, it's the mid-2000s, we're just going to do this. So, and that's why I mainly say, again, this is just an issue that hasn't aged well. And as I said,
well, sure, I get that. Yeah.
Like it's good, as I said, if my suspicion about how the relationship between Amy and the 11th Doctor is characterized, if that's as true as I think it is, it's good to see again Moffat sort of learning from these mistakes, because there's almost, I don't know. Again, you're a bit more of an expert on this than I am, but like, there's something similar. Like, so he meets the Duchess when she's a kid, and he meets Amy when she's a kid. Isn't that true? But like with Amy, like it's a purely
there's
like
a weird parallel there.
like platonic thing, and you know what I mean. Like this is what I say, learning from.
Look. Like it's in both situations when the Doctor meets the child, it is platonic.
Yeah. Oh
Let's
yeah.
just
Yeah.
put
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
out
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. Yeah. But like the whole that again having like those frustrating sort of romantic elements, it's like he learns from that. I think. So that's an interesting point. I guess I'll make. Here's the thing though, for me, and I don't know. Oh, I didn't know how soon I was going to get into this. I was going to save it a little bit. Oh, well, we'll see how we go. So basically, the romantic stuff does, again, it really annoys me. Again, it is icky, it is dumb, it's frustrating. But the thing is, in terms of the way the Doctor and the Duchess interact, if the even if it was like a completely platonic thing, it would the way they interact still frustrates me to an unbelievable degree.
Interesting.
And I'm not sure. Again, I'm just not sure I should get into it now or save it a bit later, because there's other stuff in the episode that we should probably talk about.
Well, I mean, we're on the subject of Madame de Pompadour now, so I think it makes sense to get into it now. I will also say real quick that, like, I think to some degree, a part of why the episode is sort of presented the way it is because they cast Sophie Myles to play Madame de Pompadour, and at the time, she and David Tennant were in a relationship.
Oh, really? Oh,
yeah.
Right.
So I think that may be why there is maybe more of that kind of
that
subtextual thing you might be picking up on.
That might make sense.
Yeah.
That's a part of it, I guess. But yeah, so So, do you want me to get into this now, or what do we,
You might as well. I mean, we're on the subject.
Yeah, that's true. That's
It would
true. That's
feel
true.
weird to double back to it later on.
Yeah. Um. Okay. So basically, trying to sort of rally my thoughts here because I do have a number of quotes, but basically, the way the Duchess interacts with the Doctor, and especially the way she talks about the Doctor, I cannot stand. There is such a, how shall I put this? When she speaks about him, there's a really, really repugnant religious quality to it. I cannot
Religious
stand,
quality.
like, we. Okay, so I believe that Moffat has an issue. It's true of, I think, a good chunk of his run, but especially in this episode, of portraying the Doctor as not only a sort of over mythologized character, not only a character who has quite maybe a lot of power or potential to have a lot of power, but I honestly think that he presents the Doctor as a character that is, frankly, at best, borderline morally infallible. And that, I think, is
Oh,
true here.
hang on.
And,
Sorry, no. I right off the bat, I have to completely disagree with that
sure.
perspective. But
Hmm.
you keep going for now.
And it drives me up the wall. It is, in my view, critical that we feel ambiguous about this character, that we feel ambiguous about who they are, how much power they have, and that we
Yeah,
do
of course.
not veer too much in this weird, almost religious worship of this character. And I know
Well,
that this is really strong emotive language. I'll go through
yeah.
what I'm talking about in
Well,
more detail, but
real quick before you continue, I
sure,
would like
yeah.
to point out that you've singled out Moffat for this, but he as a showrunner is sandwiched between Russell T Davies, who literally wrote an episode in which two angels lift the Doctor up and carry him skyward,
Mm-hmm.
and then Chris Chibnall, who I would argue does this to a way more big
Mm-hmm.
extent than
Mm-hmm.
Moffat ever does. Chris
Mm-hmm.
Chibnall's problem with making the Doctor infallible is not even subtextual; it is
Mm-hmm.
completely overt. Moffat has many, many instances where he presents the Doctor as morally grey,
Mm-hmm.
but you know, uh, I can't. Mm,
Mm-hmm.
for the purposes of this episode, keep going because I think there is something there. I do not for a second understand where the religion stuff is coming from in
Sure, sure.
Moffat,
Sure,
but
sure.
but maybe I'll pick it up as
Yep, yep, yep.
we keep going. Like for
Yep.
example, the way that I've pointed out stuff with Rose that you haven't noticed before, it's very, very possible
Yep,
that you'll
yeah.
do the same
Sure,
with
sure, sure.
Moffat for me. But
Absolutely.
go on.
So yeah, so he's presented as this character, as this mythological, magical fireplace man who shows up and scares the monsters away. And the way that even the Duchess just talks about him sort of cements this idea of him as this magical being who can do no wrong, who just comes in again to just sort of always save the day, and it happens to such a degree that it just I can't deal with it. I hope I'm structuring this as well as I can. But anyway, so I've got a number of quotes here that I've written down. And I'll just go through them now to hopefully just give a bit of a picture of how this all sort of fits together. So stuff like, My Lonely Doctor. Like, God, that's just it just seems so stupid to me. It's like painting the Doctor, and I've got another thing which I've written down here. I'm going to read this last note word for word. My poor soft boy Doctor. Like, the idea that this woman has been so taken with this person that he's like, oh boy, he's just this magical person who's going to come in and make everything better. The reason why this bothers me is because it's so this element seems to be so potent to me in especially in this episode that it ignores any other interpretation that you could make of the Doctor. It's and
Okay.
again, yeah. Do you want to say something?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, first of all, I'll
Sure.
say that not every episode needs to do a morally grey thing with the Doctor. I think especially with single episode things,
Mm-hmm.
there is room to just have the Doctor be the main character. Like not every episode needs to go out of its way to present the Doctor as morally grey. I prefer it when they do, but it's not necessary for individual stories. With this one particularly, I don't think it's nearly as big of a problem as you do.
Mm-hmm.
For the specific reason that, like, look at it from her perspective.
Mm-hmm.
A man literally did show up in her fireplace to scare the monster away. That is just a fact based on her interpretation of events. That is what happened.
Then that shouldn't have. Sorry.
Well, I mean, for the sake of the story, it needed to happen.
Then
I don't really understand why it's a problem.
Then it shouldn't have been a part of the story.
Why?
Because presenting the Doctor to this extent as you know, a lot of lacking in that moral ambiguity is something I cannot.
But here's the thing, though. We've seen the Doctor in other, like, again, this is the story. Like, we've already seen the Doctor in other situations where it's been morally grey stuff. In the previous episode, for example, we explore how he will often dump companions and then never see them ever again. As the audience, we already have this in the back of our mind. It's not like watching this episode is going to overwrite those things that we already know about the character. Again, this episode is a character study of Madame de Pompadour. And again, like, I think inserting any of that stuff into this dynamic would overstuff the episode to a weird degree. You know, and she even, like, I think you're ignoring certain aspects of the characterization. Like, she says, you know, I've seen your world and I don't want any part of it. Like, that's it right there. Like, and, you know, like, the way, and that's explored with Queen Victoria as well. The way the Doctor lives his life, you know, the way he, you know, goes from tragedy to tragedy without really seeming to have it affect him at all. Lets it all breeze past him because he can't afford to let it affect him at all. That side is there. It's just that, because, again, I think, and again, it goes back to there being a romantic subplot as well. That is the. She's by no means the only character to have this opinion in the show. And it's, again, it's. I just don't find it as like gut wrenchingly morally bad as you do. I think primarily also because, like, it will be done worse in the future. And also, like, the quotes that you pulled, like, they're not religious.
Oh, I haven't finished them.
Oh, okay, sorry.
yeah, it's okay. That's fine. And I do see what you mean there, and we'll get into a bit more later on. But yeah, so things like, and I'll try to just run through these and give bits of commentary with each one. Putting them together hopefully will make my point a bit stronger. It may not for you personally, and that's fine. But anyway, so things like the monsters and the Doctor. It seems you cannot have one without the other. There's something really annoying about, again, saying, "Oh yeah, he's the great combatter of monsters, and it's so wonderful. Let's all just acknowledge that." And here's the thing: do you know why you can't have the monsters without the Doctor? It's because, and I know this kind of goes against what you just sort of pointed out, but the reason is because I certainly wouldn't say that the Doctor's a monster. He does, they do rather many amazing things, but they have monstrous qualities within them, and it's absolutely critical to maintain that element. I mean, and you say that, you know, for the purposes of the story, this is why it has to happen. The levels to which the Doctor is described as a force for moral good in this episode, for me, it is so intense.
See, I just don't get that at all.
I would rather. I would like. No, it's all right. It's okay. I understand. Like it's for me, it comes across as so intense that, like, I'd rather not have the story at all if this is the only interpretation they're trying to offer us with the Doctor. Anyway,
I just don't think that's the interpretation they're going for in the first place.
Yeah.
I'll put it this way: like, the line "you can't have the monsters without the Doctor." Again, like, that's not a theme that's unique to this episode, and it's something that's been brought up in the past. And also back on the, I
Mhm.
Initially I was like, you know what, monsters are afraid of me. That line, I was initially going to agree with you on that, but then I'm
Mm.
thinking, okay, so what's the difference between that and then the Doctor saying to the Daleks, they call me the oncoming storm. You remove your emotions, but you're still afraid of me. Like again, like these are consistent aspects of the character that even though those
Mhm.
elements are being more pronounced in this episode, it doesn't mean that those other elements of the character have been abandoned.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think there is Moffat clearly has that understanding because he
Mhm.
has in the past in his
Mhm.
other story, Empty Child, there were those elements coming in where Jack was at odds with the Doctor, and he, uh, yeah, again, like Moffat isn't. It's so difficult because like this episode doesn't bring any of that stuff up, but
Mm.
like I said, that doesn't mean that
Mm.
he is that's not present in the character. For
Sure.
example, there are some stories which unambiguously paint the Doctor as the bad guy,
Mhm.
but that doesn't mean that the show is now saying, well, throw out all your
Mhm.
DVDs. The
Yeah. Yeah.
Doctor's never been good. He's a bad guy now.
Yeah.
Like there are stories in which the Doctor can just be the hero, and I think that's okay.
Mhm.
I don't think that this episode is painting the picture of this Doctor as an infallible force for good nearly as much as you've interpreted it as.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think that's largely because it's Renette who's saying all this. She's has a romantic interest in the Doctor, so obviously she's going to pronounce those features.
Mhm.
She's French, so she's got this flair for the poetic anyway.
Mm.
I
Mhm.
think when you consider all these elements in context,
Mhm.
I don't personally see it as that big a deal. And you better believe I will see this as a huge deal when it comes to other stories down the line that try to do this and do it worse.
Sure.
When it comes to stuff like, because look at it this way, the
Mhm.
Doctor is presented as infallible when it comes to the situation of don't take the brain from this person. There doesn't need to be any morally grey stuff there. He's right.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
shouldn't do that.
Yeah.
When the Doctor is being presented as morally infallible in the case of this mega corporation is doing nothing wrong,
Mhm.
then we can have words.
Yeah.
I think that situation is
Yeah. Yeah.
significantly
Yeah.
worse
Yeah.
than
Yeah.
this one is.
Yeah. Um. Yeah. Yeah. Fair. 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 Um.
But I'm
Yeah.
not.
I mean, I
I'm not
guess
for a
I get.
second going to say that you're not allowed to interpret it
No.
this
No.
way.
No. That's no. It makes sense. It makes sense. And if I have to rethink my position, so be it.
Mm-hmm.
But like there are other moments. So here, like, where she says, "Sorry, let me just get this up." It
Just before you jump in
Yeah, go
there, I
ahead.
have a thought, and I don't want it to escape my head.
Sure.
But even in the story, the villains that they're fighting aren't presented as this, you know, Machiavellian pure evil. Like the thing that I will highlight, and it's something that I noticed for the first time on this watch. It's the way the Doctor talks to the clockwork android right as the connection is severed.
Mhm.
When the mirror's gone all bricks. Um, and there's a weird like melancholy aspect to it, like with the music that's playing and the language the Doctor is using. It
What is that? Is this the 7 years bad? Talk about 7 years bad luck
It's
bit.
that scene, but it's
Yeah,
also the
but that.
language he's
Yeah.
using with
Yeah.
you have no purpose, and like they've got the close ups on the android's quote unquote
Yeah. Sure.
face, and the
Mhm.
music that's playing. It honestly comes across as like really sad because like it's not their fault that they're malfunctioning in this way. They've clearly got some degree of autonomy slash self awareness. They're
Mm.
able to hold
Mhm.
conversations.
Mm.
So even in this episode, the bad guys aren't treated as all bad. There is a tragic element to their character that's highlighted when they shut themselves down. Um, and,
I.
and and that's
Mm.
highlighted even more because when the Doctor says they have no purpose, that's also he's talking about himself now that he's been cut off from the TARDIS. There are bit more layers to this stuff than I think you're giving the
Mhm.
episode credit for.
I don't. That element with the clockwork robots. I don't see it. I think. Um. Yeah. I mean, like I kind of see what you mean, but I don't think there's a tragic quality to them. Perhaps because they are, sort of. I mean, to put it simply, like robots. Maybe I'm misinterpreting that, but I just don't see that. Anyway, but I'll continue if I may.
Sure. Yeah.
Um, so things like what have we got here? When she said, it happened, child, and I would not have it any other way. One may tolerate a world of demons for the sake of an angel.
That's where I'm starting to fit. Yeah.
Jesus Christ! I've
But I
literally
think
wrote, I literally wrote that. That is what I wrote in these notes.
yeah, but
I,
once again, I would say if this was a companion saying this or someone from the modern era, I would give it to you. But again, she's French, she's poetic, she's putting it in a way that she can understand it because she has this 18th century mindset.
well, that's the problem for me, right? Because you mentioned before that the companion is the audience's eyes, yeah, they're the ones who
Yes.
see how this all works together. I actually noticed that like the companions, Mickey and Rose. I mean, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but they don't have a lot to do here. It is very
No,
much a
their
yeah,
goal is to discover the
yeah,
inner workings of the ship
yeah.
and report back to
It's
the
it's
doctor.
it's the Doctor and the Duchess. That's what we're focusing on here. So
Yeah.
So yeah, so that's I think the key issue. Because the thing is, she does have depth. It's not that she doesn't. It's not that she's like a shallow character or anything. She's clearly curious and interested, and she's got enough intelligence to you know uh pierce through into the Doctor's mind.
Yeah.
But the problem is that like in a way, because she's so interesting, it makes it more problematic for me because she's so enamored with the Doctor that um, that interpretation for her, like that seemingly consumes her, and it just because it for me, I feel it's emphasized as much as it is. It does become really frustrating. Like, so here's another example, and again, I'll just go through more and more of this, but like if my nightmare can return to plague me, then rest assured, so will yours. That's what she says to the Clockwork people, which
Yeah.
makes sense in context of the episode because again, Fireplace Man saving the day.
It's also not dissimilar to other rhetoric that companions have used. Like
Hmm.
Rose in this episode almost directly tries to oncoming storm right back
Yeah,
to
yeah,
the
yeah.
Clockwork Androids. Like she starts using similar language in
Although
this
to
as
be
well.
fair, that I think is aided by the fact that it's kind of cut off and it's made a comedic moment. Like the irony and the humor kind of stops it from becoming that. That may be more of a personal interpretation, but in
Sure,
any
but like
case,
there are other moments
yeah,
in the series where it
yeah,
happens,
yeah,
and
yeah,
while
yeah,
one of the
yeah. Where
subjects,
it's
Rose
like
gets captured or trapped number
here's
14.
like here's the Doctor, and yeah,
Sure. I didn't want
indeed,
that to be missed, but Rose
indeed
gets
the
captured or trapped number 14. It happens again. We've
yeah.
had an episode break from her getting captured or trapped. It's happened again now.
Mm-hmm,
Yes, it happens with Mickey as well, but this is only like he doesn't. It's not a big deal with Mickey because he's intentionally being portrayed as kind of bumbling and idiotic at the moment. He hasn't had his quote unquote growth yet. Rose
mm-hmm,
supposedly has, but putting that
mm-hmm.
aside because they're not a huge part of the
Yeah,
story
yeah,
anyway.
yeah. I mean, and to be fair, like we mentioned oncoming storm, but that's an RTD thing, yeah.
It is,
Like
which is why
yeah,
I think a lot of this stuff
yeah, yeah, yeah.
is sort of more highlighted because of
Mm-hmm,
what's come before it. Like Moffat is clearly pulling from a lot of what's happened in the past
sure.
season to form some of this stuff, which I think is maybe why
Mm-hmm,
there is the romantic side of things. Because again,
mm-hmm,
the current
sure.
companion is romantically involved with the Doctor, which is why it is so baffling to me that the dynamic in this episode between the Doctor and Annette is causing this kind of reaction in you, but it's not when it comes to the Doctor and Rose. Because again,
Mm-hmm,
in that situation, it is requited, which to me makes it so much worse.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Um, I think. Anyway, yeah. So I'll keep going. The so yeah. So like that element for me, my nightmare, if my nightmare can return to plague me, then rest assured, so yours. The way I interpreted it is like it's not, and again, you probably could argue this is not the point of the episode, but like there's no as interesting as the Duchess is as a character, like she's not empowered in that moment, or really most of the episode. It's not a question of her sort of, um, I don't know, like learning from the Doctor to try and save herself and save others. It's basically, I have this imaginary friend, quote unquote. I know how to call on him, so I'm just going to call him, and he's just going to come and save the day. And that, for me, that element becomes quite frustrating. And I understand that there are probably other times where Rose perhaps does this.
Oh yeah, to a way more
Mhm.
shocking degree.
Yeah. But for me, it strikes me as, yeah, frustrating.
Mm. Well, I don't
The
think. Look, I'm sorry. I've been interrupting a lot, and I know
It's
you
okay.
probably
No,
have a
it's all
lot more to
right.
say in
I
this matter,
understand.
but I don't necessarily think that interpretation is a bad one.
Mhm.
I see where you're coming from.
Mhm.
My initial reaction to that scene, it was more that she's learned to sort of stand up for herself, and it's not to the extent where she can do anything about it because they
Yeah.
are robots from the future.
Yeah.
But she's putting a brave face on it. You know, she's not. She's talking back to them. She's not. In the literally the last time she
Mhm.
encountered them, they spooked her, so she was like, "Go away." But this time she's
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
"I'm
Yeah.
not
So it's
afraid."
showing for you, like it's showing growth in that sense.
Yeah, it's the
Yeah.
growth from like
Yeah.
it's not it's the fear side of things that she's learned to overcome. Like she was
Yeah.
afraid of them as a kid. To
Mm.
some extent, she was afraid of them in her late
Mm.
20s. I want to say when she met the King of France in that scene. I don't know what it
Yeah.
was. They
Yeah.
didn't say. But now she's
Either way, she's
37.
grown up and
Yeah,
she's
through
learning.
through her encounters with the Doctor, she's learned to not be afraid, which
Yep.
again
Sure.
is a theme from the RTD era.
Mm.
The entire first season of the
Mhm.
show is about
Sure.
companions being or characters being influenced by the Doctor for personal growth.
Mm.
It's not as pronounced because again, it's not like in the Eccleston era where those characters would take proactive steps after that growth happened.
Mhm.
We're now in the Tennant era, and Tennant is way more of a swashbuckling hero type Doctor. He's way more of a John Pertwee. He'll enter the fray. He'll throw hands. He'll use a fire extinguisher. He'll jump through a mirror riding a horse.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, there's those other aspects of the Doctor from the classic era, especially in John Pertwee's era, that are now being more pronounced now that we've got a new Doctor on.
Mhm.
But it does mean that some agency is taken away from Madame
Yeah.
Pompadour in that moment. So I get where you're coming
Yeah.
from.
Yeah. Yeah. And to be fair, yeah, I wonder if there are other episodes. I can't think of any specific examples at the moment, but in either revival or classic, where the amount of, I suppose, power or impact the characters have, even if it's being superseded by what the Doctor has, that still doesn't mean there isn't room for growth in that sense. Anyway, so I think this is the thing. There's one element here, a line that she says. This is what really stuck out to me.
Mm-hmm.
She calls the Doctor an angel 3 times. And between the first
Yeah.
time watching this and the second time watching this is the element that really made me think, oh, Fitz, come on, you're exaggerating. She probably only called him that once. Nope, it's 3 times. And it ends, and I think this is probably maybe the biggest issue for me, the ending, because let's say, for example, let's say that he shows up back in France, watching a carriage go away, and he's just sort of left there to really sort of reflect on, the potential impact he could have had on this woman's life, and how, again, saying goodbye to companions, how painful that is, and more, issues of mortality and things like that. Let's say that happened, and then he just got back in the TARDIS. If that
Yeah.
happened, the rest of it would still really annoy me, but I could just kind of forgive that. But unfortunately, that's not what we got. What we got was then him reading a letter that she'd wrote, which includes, and oh God, I'm wondering whether I should start this now, because I was going to make a big song and dance saying, oh, I think it's time for me to open up my own magic counter. You've got your Rose gets kidnapped or trapped counter. I'm tempted to put up my own the Doctor's Great speeches counter. And I was very tempted to do that here. I'll go into a bit more what I mean about that shortly. But anyway, the point is, that's what we end with. We end with this Doctor's Great speech where this woman's clearly just like just been taken in by this magical person who's just come in and just saved the day, and it ends with her saying, "I've seen the world inside your head and know that all things are possible." And then I'm not sure if there's anything else after that, but then she says, "Godspeed, my lonely angel." Like, Cuff, I understand where you're coming from, but like, come on. I've seen the world inside your head and know that all things are possible. That sounds like something that's been ripped out of a Catholic hymn. It's like, oh wow, just this.
Ah.
God. It.
Ah.
Mm,
I don't think I would go that far, but I
Mm-hmm.
do get it.
Yeah.
My look, I still think that that ending is basically what you described it as initially. It is that whole thing of the Doctor left to
Mm.
ruminate on how have I affected this person's life through
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
own involvement. Because again, like it's not. This is again the biggest tip off for me that he wasn't romantically interested. He doesn't
Yeah.
shed
Yeah.
a single tear
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
at any point
Yeah.
throughout this entire
Um.
sequence. I was waiting for it. I
Yeah.
was expecting like he folds the letter, wipes away a tear, and then goes back to the task. No, not a
Mm.
single tear. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's clear that he's just left there
Mm-hmm.
to ponder what have I done to this poor woman.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, it was I clearly needed to get involved because otherwise she would have died horrifically and history would have been
Yeah.
horribly altered.
Mm.
But you know, at what cost? What have I like? You know,
Yeah.
this person's entire life was consumed by me.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
You know, that again, that's the way I interpret it because again, there is no romantic lingering moment where the Doctor sort of looks up at the sky and you know thinks about her. There's no like flashbacks to moments earlier in the story where they were together.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
He's just left there alone to ponder what he's done.
Yeah.
That is,
Sure.
and again, purely because that element of the 10th Doctor is so pronounced in his run, that I think is what I focus on way more than you focus on
Mm-hmm.
the other side of things.
Yeah.
And again, like I said earlier, I do think the truth or like the actual intention is probably somewhere in the middle.
In the middle.
Because
Yeah.
because I don't think there is any religious undertone that at least Moffat had intended to put in.
Mm-hmm.
The angel stuff, I think, is largely attributed to the poetic nature of pre-revolutionary French. That side of it all. Again because of the whole he is not reciprocating the feelings. He's not romantically involved. He's not silently shedding a tear upon her death.
Yeah. Sure. I think sort of while we've been speaking, I've been trying to sort of marshal some thoughts here, but
Okay.
yeah. So for me, because. And I think it does kind of go back to what I talked about with sentimentality, which, as I said, that's kind of, for me, the underlying issue in Moffat's writing. This is just, in my view, the most pertinent way it manifests.
Sure. Which makes sense. It is
yeah.
It is a sentimental episode. So
Yeah.
I can't really fault that.
And I cannot stand over sentimentality, and I'll freely admit this is the most personal element for me. And if people want to criticize me for that's fine. I have a real problem with excessive sentimentality. There's something extremely dishonest and deceitful about it, and I think historically Doctor Who is not an overly sentimental show. There's sentiment, like, and even sentimentality in it, but it doesn't. It's not excessive. It certainly isn't in the classic series, and I don't think it is too much in RTD's era. There may be, perhaps I'm wrong, but in any case, you know what I mean. Like it's for me, it's not as emphasized. So for me, it's like I understand what you mean when you say that the sentimental element manifesting in, again, what I perceive to be this mythologizing of the Doctor. I understand what you mean when you say it's not super deliberate. Like, it's not like, I don't know, Moffat's trying to, like, deliberately sweep away everything and say, oh, look, guys, look at, how wonderful this person is. But for me, that's, I don't know, almost like kind of the point. Like, I don't, whether he means to or not doesn't actually matter, to me.
Oh, like, sorry,
what matters.
My point wasn't specifically that it wasn't intentional. My point was I just don't think it is even a thing in this episode. I don't think that's even the point of the whole thing. I just don't read that side of it as much as you do. But it could be a case of that's where the Moffat era is heading because there is a certain amount of foreshadowing in this story. We do get an incredibly forced Doctor Who.
Yeah, that drove me up the wall.
Yeah, and then it's followed by it's more than just a name, isn't it?
Yeah,
like, he's teasing the war.
Yeah,
Doctor.
we know where that's going.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which that definitely annoyed me. But yes, just for me, again, I'm just trying to rally all these things together. But for me, the fact that this character keeps saying these things, calling him an angel 3 times in the script, saying these things over and over and over again, and the fact that the episode ends with this Doctor is great speech, which concludes with her saying, again, I've seen the world in your head and I know that all things are possible, as if that's some sort of amazing, great thing. and then to then say, Godspeed, my lonely angel. There's For me, it doesn't seem like there's room for any other form of interpretation here. And because it's
Well,
so intense, it like I feel like the show can't afford to do that. The Doctor,
uh,
the
you
Doctor, like
finish.
I know, and I see what you mean when you say that, like it's a part of, the Duchess's characterization, right? Like it's about the fact that she's, perhaps French and poetic, and this is how she processes things. But the Doctor's not an angel. We cannot have this.
Well, I
I
again
don't
like
want to see this in my
sorry.
characterizations
Yeah, yeah,
of the
yeah. But
Doctor.
and
Uh,
again, I don't think it's there. I
mhm,
think you're missing the point because
mhm,
like there is the language that she is calling him an angel and saying all things are possible while he is standing in his very like scientifically based time travel machine,
mhm,
knowing he cannot go back and see her because it's not
mhm,
possible.
mhm,
You know,
mhm.
it's her language juxtaposed with the
With
truth,
his,
which is there.
mhm,
Like we can see that these things
mhm,
aren't true, and
mhm,
I think that's why her demise is more tragic.
mhm.
It's what
Then
brings that
then
tragic element to the character
the
because she's
romantic.
saying these things and we know them to be false, and he knows them to
Mhm.
be false,
Sure.
which is I think another reason why the ending is less of a romantic gut punch and more of a whole,
Yeah.
what have you done to this lady?
Yeah.
Because like
Yeah. I
it's
get. No.
not
I
like
guess. I
it's not
guess that
like
makes
it's
sense.
well in I draw comparisons to other things that have done similar imagery in the
Sure.
past where it's like they've called their characters angels as they are standing, silhouetted by the sun on a big mountain top with, the music swelling as if it's an angel's choir. That's not what we're
Yeah.
getting here.
Sure.
I don't think it's that overt. Like it's not a Man of
Yeah.
Steel situation
Mhm.
where Superman is being overtly portrayed as a Jesus figure as he
Yeah.
floats down to Earth with his arms outstretched
Yeah.
as if he was on the cross.
As I mean, granted, I'm like not a Superman or comic book fan, but as I understand it, that's one of the criticisms of Superman. That's he's
It's
a
certainly
bit.
one of the criticisms of Snyder's Superman,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
many people seem to overlook.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Sure.
but
Sure.
yeah,
Sure.
I think
Mhm.
you're not wrong to point out these things, and I think that in a if you give the same speech to Chris Chibnall, he doesn't interpret it in any other way. He goes, "This is what
Mhm.
it is." But
Yeah.
again, because we have all this other context, and we know that the Doctor isn't an angel, and we know
Mhm.
that
That there's
The
the
world of Doctor
irony.
Who, yeah, we know that the world of Doctor Who isn't
Mhm.
full of limitless possibilities. There are
Sure.
rules. The Doctor
Yeah.
in this episode says a rule. We're now
Mhm.
part of events. We can't use the TARDIS to get to France.
Yeah. Yep. Yep.
Moffat
Mhm.
is keenly aware of the fact that the
Mhm.
world of Doctor Who isn't limitless. He
Yeah.
knows that the world is bound and governed by rules.
Mhm.
So, putting the Doctor, like having
Mhm.
presented the Doctor with this view of himself that he's inadvertently built up in someone else's head, is a
Mhm.
part of the tragedy of the whole situation, and I don't
Sure.
think it's meant to be the point of it all. Now,
Mhm.
again, that being said, this might end up being grossly. This might end up becoming incredibly uh, outdated when we review other Moffat stories that intentionally do this, but
Yeah.
I don't think that this is that.
Uh huh. Mhm. Um. Yeah. So I'll say a couple of things, I guess. So, for me, how should I put this? Okay. No. I'll start off the opposite way. So I do kind of understand what you mean there, and it is possible that my blinding hatred for these lines in and of themselves and the way that they're incorporated has made me, has created some blind spots, and it's made me unaware of some of these ironies. For me, I see what you mean about the whole, him obviously being very sad that she's dead, and sort of reckoning with the cost of traveling through time and whatnot. Um, I feel like, and again, this is probably just a difference of opinion, these small sort of hair splitty things.
Mm.
I don't think that element is emphasized as much, perhaps as much as you think it is, and certainly not emphasized enough. And I think it's, again, mainly because I mean, I know this isn't how it literally ends, because it literally ends with, like, image of the spaceship, and they leave and things like that. But the fact that we have, a doctor's great speech being sort of the crux of this for me, the fact that that's sort of brought up at all, it just really frustrates me. And I'll bring this back to something which I sort of touched on, but I didn't uh, quite expand on. Um, for me, the sentimentality, you know, in how it manifests, um, it's so it feels so potent to me that, like, God, this might sound really shitty, but I would there's a part of me that almost wants to say I would rather this character not the Duchess, I mean, not be in the story. I'd almost rather this story not exist at all if it means that we didn't have these painfully sentimental moments that just seem disingenuous to me. Now, having said all of that, you have admittedly given me quite a bit to think about.
Yeah.
I don't
Um,
think I'm not sure how much you'll sway me, but you've swayed me a little bit. Let's
yeah.
let's
Well,
put it that way.
I'll add one more thing, and I don't want it to
Sure.
sound like I've been consistently shitting on your opinion because it
No, it's
isn't.
all right. It's okay.
But
I
one thing I
understand.
will say is I do think there is a slight something else because it admittedly is a Doctor is Great speech, but it's a
Yeah,
Doctor is Great speech in the context of he's failed her.
yeah.
You know,
As I've said, the irony.
well, yeah, he's
Yeah,
reading this speech having just let
just
her
watched her.
down,
Sure. Yeah.
which is why I think that
Mm-hmm.
the level of irony is present more than you think it is. Because again,
Sure.
if this was a situation of he reads the note, then flings it over his shoulder, fiddles with the TARDIS controls, and then takes off for France to see her one last time, I
Mm-hmm.
think that would be the sentimentality that you're talking about here. But again,
Yeah.
it's there's a bit more going on here than I think you've given
Mm-hmm.
it credit
Sure.
for. Now,
Sure.
again, I'm not saying that the elements that you've brought up are uh, flat out incorrect because they are there to a certain
Yeah.
degree.
Sure.
And
Sure.
like I said at the beginning of the episode, people are free to interpret fiction however
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
want.
Yeah. Yeah. Of course.
I just think that it's important to, before having done that, having it's considering multiple different points of view is important in any kind of
Yeah. Of course.
discussion.
Of course. Of
And
course.
it's obviously less important in fiction and more important in something like the state of the world of politics, where you really do
Yeah.
need
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
listen to all sides
Yeah. No. Of
before
course.
doing anything. Um, but and I think it's showing that we've been able to get through this, our first actual proper, what I'm gonna uh, uh, loosely call debate that we've
Mm-hmm.
had on this show, and we've come through it without being, that's it, the podcast is cancelled. I can't work in this town anymore. You know nothing about
Oh.
Doctor Who.
Oh. We've been friends for longer than that, Cuff. You know I'd never rage quit over this.
No, you'd stick it out long enough to prove me wrong. That's what you do.
That's what I'm doing. I'm rubbing my hands here. I'm waiting for the right moment.
This
For the
is a this has been
Moffatisms
a
to become clear.
this has been a long discussion, and I think we've basically hit the end of it.
Um,
I like the Clockwork Androids as villains. I think they're really interesting.
I do apologize. Can I just mention one thing here?
Yeah,
With this, you mentioned the Chibnall thing, and I will briefly touch on that here. I'm glad you brought that up because I think that is certainly true. Because there's definitely issues in Moffat's writing that I see that are present in Chibnall's writing. For me personally, like just on a immediate visceral reaction, the reason why it doesn't bother me with Chibnall, and I've mentioned this before, is because Chibnall's writing, it's very easy for me to rationalize. It's just bad writing. That's what it is. It's clear that the writing, it's demonstrating a lack of care and a lack of understanding of basic technique and building blocks of story writing. It's just bad. I can deal with that. For me with Moffat, it's worse because I know he can write, right? Like I know he can do all these really good, piece of technique, which we'll also get into, even though we haven't yet. But um, the that in a way kind of makes it even more frustrating for me. The fact that he's using his good writing skills to these ends, these sentimental and
sure.
yeah, these sentimental ends. So anyway, but yeah,
Well,
I wanted to raise that because I'm
careful
glad
if
you brought
you.
that up.
I just want to say, if you criticize sentimentality too much, you're going to be seen as the Scrooge of the show.
Yeah, no, that's fair.
And we're waiting for your heart to grow 3 sizes in one of these discussions.
Yeah. No, that's fair.
No, but there is. I think sentimentality has its place, and there will be
Oh yeah,
instances
no,
coming
no.
up
It does
where.
when you find it, in a
Yeah.
movie or a show, and it feels earned, and it feels, um, you, you know, I don't know, put into context or used correctly. It's the best thing in the whole wide world,
Mm.
and it can make you feel so good because life can be really shitty. Let's be honest.
Yeah.
But for me, just personally, when it's used in a way that's dishonest, or disingenuous or forced, then it really gets my goat as a point of comparison. And I'm not going to get into this topic because Christ, we don't have enough time.
No, we
Um, Baz Luhrmann's movies bother me for a similar reason. Just
don't.
to give you a picture of that, you understand the context of that. But
Oh,
anyway.
I've been hearing about your hatred for Baz Luhrmann way longer than I've been hearing about your hatred for Moffat.
Yeah, yeah, that's a whole topic which we're definitely not going to get into. But anyway, but
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
the point.
Let's
That's
little
to
hint at some Fitz backstory and lore for you
yeah,
audience who
yeah.
maybe don't know him all that
To
well.
just yeah to just give you you Cuff personally a picture of how I view this. So
Mm.
anyway,
Sure.
so now that we've gone through that, yes, we can move on to other stuff. And there is actually other
Yeah.
things that I really like about this episode that I do want to talk about.
Sure.
To wit, the clockwork robots.
Yeah, they're fantastic.
They're really cool. Yeah, they are. They're original. They're interesting. They're creepy. And I must say, and this is one of the bits of Moffat's writing that I actually really love. It's one of my favorite parts of his writing, and he deserves all the praise in the world he normally gets for. Yeah, I think for the most part gets for it.
Yeah.
He is what I would describe as a brilliant nightmare maker. Um,
Oh yeah, you're
night.
talking about the evocative imagery of the broken clock that's still ticking and that kind of stuff.
Well, not I mean that, and I'll get into that more in a little bit as well. But just generally, some of the most frightening and compelling and just soul-shaking images and concepts that have shown up in all of Doctor Who's history have come from Moffat. Gas mask zombies, weeping angels. I will freely say that they're one of the best monsters in all of Doctor Who, the whole history of it. Um,
Yeah.
Clockwork robots, Mondasian Cybermen. The scene with with the Mondasian Cybermen when they're being given sedatives and it's clearly just to turn down the volume of their internal screaming. Maybe I don't know because I've spent a fair bit of time in hospital, but like that really got to me when I first saw it. Anyway,
Yeah.
the point is, brilliant Nightmare Maker, and it's on full display here. It's so that bit is it's so fantastic and chilling, and that scene when the Doctor
The
does
first
come to
encounter,
save,
yeah.
yeah, how great is that? It's so
Oh yeah, it's really great.
the way it's constructed, the way it's paced, and incidentally, the interesting thing is, like, I would describe Moffat to an extent as kind of an auteur, yeah, right? He's got a unique vision. That in itself is kind of one of the reasons why I have such a problem with his writing, because he does sort of, you know, does his own thing sort of a bit too much, and the way he does it is what sort of
Yeah.
bothers me. But
Well, it's interesting, just real quick, he uses a similar technique here that he did in Empty Child.
I was
You
gonna
know,
say, yeah, exactly. It's the whole what's that? Where's that sound coming from? It's not
yeah, the
the
end of the
the
tape,
thing.
the end of,
It's the other thing.
yeah, it's the end of the tape, but we can still hear the child speaking.
Yeah,
Or the kid moved away from the
and
typewriter, but it's still going. Like,
yeah,
it's a,
or the clock is broken. So where's the ticking coming from? And
I don't.
the,
I just off the top of my head, I can't recall an instance when he uses it after this. But like, it's interesting that it's come up again so quickly after the first
well,
time.
yeah, again, and that's kind of the great bit. But as I say, there is an auteur quality to Moffat, and again,
If it
as
works, it works.
yeah, as frustrated as I can be with some of the other sort of more auteur elements, generally speaking, and this is true with all sort of auteur filmmakers, for example, I do find it very fascinating to find some of these connections uh, between different stories. So, if there's like a shot in a Kubrick film, for example, that I notice, he's got the same shot in a bunch of these movies. That's really fascinating. Same thing here. It's really interesting to see that sort of pacing and sort of similar scenario show up again here. But because,
Yeah.
again, it's not in service of over sentimentality, far from it bothering me, I think it's great. I think it's really cool and interesting. So,
Yeah.
yeah, definitely
Well,
will bring that
also
up.
we touched on it as well, but like you talked about the dark nature of the Mondasian Cybermen. Again, like there's a similar thing here with the cooking meat in the ship being the crew.
Yeah.
Soylent
Yeah.
Green is people. It's that similar kind of vibe of he can sometimes just go really, really dark, but also have it serve the story in what is
Yeah.
otherwise not a particularly dark
I'll,
affair.
I'll actually put it in this way, right? And again, this is another kind of dig, but I'll mention it anyway. one of the ways I interpreted this, and it's not just with this episode, it's with Moffat's writing overall, it almost feels like, because the sentimentality, not just with over mythologizing of the Doctor, but in a bunch of other ways, because it's so pertinent, I feel, in Moffat's writing, it's almost like the horror scenes are, I don't know, compensating for that. Again, that may just be my interpretation of it, but
Sure.
it's like, I've got, yeah, it's Christmas Day, everybody. We're great. Oh, but then again, Mondasian Cybermen. So uh,
Mm.
that's more of a quirk, perhaps, but
Yeah.
something worth mentioning, I suppose.
Well, it's not again. It's not something that's unique to
Mm.
Moffat.
Mm.
Um,
And
like
perhaps it's just more
not
noticeable.
sure, but like
Sorry.
not episodes ago, it was like it's snowing, it's ash.
Yeah. Like, yeah. It's perhaps more noticeable simply because the nightmare making is so terrifying. Because they are, again, these are
Sure, yeah.
indelible images.
Yeah, and it's also a
Um,
thing that he does quite a lot where he sort of
mm.
he takes the mundane and makes it
Makes it
scary.
frightening. Yeah.
Yeah.
A
Um,
clock, a
mm,
typewriter,
a statue.
a broken record, a hospital where people are meant to be getting well.
The
Yeah, so
shadows themselves, like literally
yes,
taking
shadows
the
that
most
eat things.
primal
Yes, of
human
course.
fear, the fear of the
Oh,
dark,
and of
and
course,
making it even more pronounced.
how could I forget? With nightmare making, hey, who turned out the lights?
Mm,
You know,
mm.
what are we talking
Yeah,
about there?
definitely.
So yeah, so that bit I'll unequivocally praise Moffat for. I think it's one of my. It's why I say the first act here is probably my most favorite part
Mm.
of the whole
I had a
thing.
feeling that like when you said that initially, I had a feeling I could pinpoint the second that that stops for you, and that's when the Doctor and Pimenta de Pompadour kiss. That is the exact moment that the episode starts going off the rails for you, isn't it?
Surprisingly not. I think it's only more when that relationship sort of gets expanded upon and the Duchess becomes more enamored. But that's like the it's one of the beginning elements, I think.
Sure.
Yeah. It's not again. For me, in
Uh
terms of
huh.
character and theme, it's not until the third act that it really falls off the rails.
Mhm.
So
Um,
anyway,
there's not much more to discuss, and we have been talking for a long time.
that
I
is
do want to very quickly touch on Rose again in this episode.
true.
Again, we've largely covered it. I've ticked another tally on the captured or trapped. We've established that the companions don't have a lot much to do in the story. I will say that it is once again telling that Rose has regressed again. The Doctor vanishes and she's not like, okay, what can we do? She's not running into the TARDIS to try and fix things. She's just standing there and she's the one that cries because once again she's become incredibly codependent. It's happening again. The Doctor goes and she literally cannot move for indecision about what to do. She's like, the Doctor's gone. Oh my god, that tunnel vision is like, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do?
Wait a minute. Wait a minute. Just what moment are we talking about here? Pardon?
After the Doctor bursts through the mirror on the horse and has
Oh,
left the
okay.
ship and has no way back.
Yeah, I thought you
Um,
meant earlier, and I was gonna say, oh, but wait, isn't she the one who's like, picks up the gun and starts walking away? And anyway, but
oh no, like that. But that moment is good characterization.
yeah, yeah,
It's one of the few moments of Rose taking a proactive step
yeah, sure.
where the Doctor's not there. But even that is largely like it's what many companions will do, where the Doctor says don't wander off, and they'll go, yeah right, I'm helping.
Sure.
I'm talking about the very end of the story when the Doctor becomes trapped in France. And she's left standing there. Mickey's like, well, what do we do? How do we get back? And he's trying to think of things to do. He's verbalizing it. But she's just standing there, looking at the broken window, crying, unable to
Sure.
do another thing because that's literally all she is. And it's bad. It's another step in her codependency, except this time her boyfriend's in the room.
Right.
And again, like in the past when this stuff has happened, she's tried to get in the TARDIS and do something about it. She's tried to open up the heart of the time vortex herself to get back to the Doctor. She's tried. She might have tried. Other companions would have started messing around with the technology for a little bit, even if it is in vain. Just like in attempt to do anything to try and help. Or they might have gone to Mickey and given him a bit of a hug, like, oh, what are we gonna do? We're stuck here. She literally cannot do a single thing because of how codependent she has become.
Sure.
Mm.
Um.
And again, this stuff is, I admit, more pronounced because I know how her story ends. And with all that stuff in context, stuff like this becomes more pronounced to me, and it becomes
Yeah,
more,
putting the pieces of the
oh,
puzzle together.
exactly, yeah.
And I wonder, even with the things I've mentioned, as well, you probably you mentioned it before, that maybe that is what I'm doing. Yes, this episode is really frustrating to me, but perhaps I am sort of putting together the dots and
Maybe.
sort of knowing where this is going to go and how it may potentially frustrate me further. Anyway,
Well, I mean, I
so
think I think
hmm,
everyone's guilty of that to some degree. There's no
yeah, yeah,
getting around it. But
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, putting the pieces of the puzzle together.
Mm.
Um, yeah, I think. There was another thing I was going to say. This is a small bit, but there's the bit where the Duchess, and this is where she makes the most sort of participatory act in the story when she shows the Doctor the fireplace that she had, meticulously sort of reconstructed or moved. And she said, when a door once open can be walked through. The way I reacted to that, certainly when watching it, was like that would be a really great piece of characterization and callback if it wasn't mired in sentimental nonsense.
Hmm.
Um, again, because it is focusing on the oh doctor, my lonely doctor, let's hold a pity party. Yeah. I'm not. I don't know how intensely I feel about that specific detail at the moment, but yeah, certainly watching it, that was a very visceral moment. So
Yeah.
we've come to the end of this. It's been a
Hmm.
while.
Yeah. Long discussion.
Yeah, and look, we'll see how my opinion possibly changes, especially once we get into the Moffat era.
Hmm.
Um, I still, at my core, have this visceral reaction to this sort of thing. And I understand what you mean, sort of saying, "Oh, we don't want people thinking you're the local Grinch." I, again, this is a whole personal thing which I don't have time to get into, but basically, yes, I do love sentimentality, but when it's not used well, it just it's like someone lying to my face, and it's so frustrating. So that's the sort of realm I come to this in. So,
Okay.
um, anyway, my overall point is, I didn't get quite as angry as I expected to get here. That's largely because you've been able to sort of open my eyes a little bit to some of the things I may have been missing, for which I'm honestly quite thankful.
Sure.
And it's possible. Look, it's possible I'm wrong. It's possible when we get into the Moffat era that I'm either over exaggerating elements, or I'm not appreciating other elements, or at the very least there could be some classic, Moffat capers that I'm missing, and you know, uh, I'm absolutely willing to be proven wrong on that. So yeah, visceral intense reaction is still there, but I'm willing to be shown different perspectives. Let's put it that way.
Sure. With all that being said, what score are you gonna give this? I am so curious.
I think I'm still going to give it a 6.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't
I'm
know if that'll
giving.
change in the future when putting it into context with the rest of Moffat's run, but
Sure.
yes, I'm going to give it a 6 for the minute.
I'm giving it an 8. I like
Hmm.
this story quite a lot.
Hmm.
There it does have its issues, but
Yeah.
I don't think they're as big a deal as you do.
Yeah.
Um, I think just purely for the storytelling of the whole, the this kind of story could have panned out much worse than it did, especially when
Hmm.
you're considering
Yeah.
Stephen Moffat.
Yeah.
It's his worst RTD story, but that's honestly
Mm.
saying something.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
Hmm.
I think I'm pretty locked in on where
Sure.
I'm
Sure.
ranking
But
that.
with the things that I pointed out, like you see what I mean, yeah.
Oh
Like
no,
maybe
yeah,
not totally, but
look, I understand where you're coming from with a lot of
hmm
this stuff, and I can understand why someone would think that would have uh, this kind of a reaction to them, and
sure.
view them as the as bad as you are.
Hmm.
But I don't think
Sure.
that it affects me in the same way for whatever reason.
Yeah.
Whether if that is a purely personal interpretation, or if either of us is straight up wrong, I
Yeah.
doubt it's the latter.
Yeah.
But yeah, I get it.
Yeah, it's true, and it's kind of like similarly with you and Rose and my reaction to Rose. I don't have that gut reaction that you have,
Mm.
but it may as cliched as it sounds, this whole thing it may just be a difference of opinion, and I know that's
Yeah,
obvious to point out, but there
I
you
mean
are.
that's always gonna happen.
Yeah, yeah,
it's entirely possible that someone listening to this disagrees with both of us somehow. But again, that's all fine, and as long as we can get through discussions like that in a civil and respectful way, then there's no problem with there being different opinions.
Indeed. And I certainly hope this discussion has been civil and relatively respectful.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah.
So next time we are wrapping up our Davros retrospective with Remembrance of the Daleks.
Should be pretty exciting.
Honestly, and I'll tee this up for the audience ahead of time. I wrote more notes for this episode than I have any other that we've looked at for this.
Really?
Podcast. I'm normally quite good at watching an episode and retaining the information in the moment that I want to remember for the podcast. Like a lot of stuff that I've brought up for this episode, I didn't write down. It was just like stuff that I was like, during the episode, I made a mental note of, okay, I've got to bring this up. With Remembrance, I've written down quite a lot because there's so much that I'm like, okay, this needs to be. I cannot risk forgetting this. This needs to be brought up.
Sure. I'm quite fascinated.
It's going to be a fucking mind-boggling episode to talk about.
We will get to it.
Until then, I'm Alex.
I'm Fitz.
And Moffat, consider this a prelude of things to come. I've been warned.
Oh, God.